Today is May 21st, 2014. My name is Jacques Habre. Today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Michael Towbes. Michael is the chairman and executive officer of the Towbes Group and Montecito Bank and Trust, a real estate developer most of his life, and a community leader and one of the community's most important philanthropists. Thank you for meeting with us today.
Sure, my pleasure.
So we're going to learn a little bit about your background and your start in your careers, and specifically some of the mentorship experiences you've had, both on the receiving side of mentoring, but also on the giving side, which we all know you've been very active in. So perhaps you can take us back to some of your early years, how you started in your career and developed an interest in real estate.
Well, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my dad was an attorney, but he really didn't practice law. He was involved in real estate and partnered up with a builder, and they built a few apartment houses back in Washington before World War II. And then the war came along, and you couldn't get materials for things like that. So he pretty much retired. But as I was growing up, I would go out on projects with him, and it was an area I was always interested in, and decided I would make that my career. I really had to think about what I wanted to do in terms of education. And I decided that civil engineering was probably a good way for me to go. I was always good at math and good in things involving engineering, so I attended Princeton and got a degree in civil engineering there. My dad used to say I would spend more time with lawyers in the development business than I would with attorneys, but I didn't pay any attention to him. It turned out he was right. I probably spent a lot more time with attorneys than I do with engineers, but engineering is still a good background if you're going to be a real estate developer, because you can sort of go head to head with your own consultants as you're using. So
would you say your father was your first mentor in some ways?
I would say he was. Yeah, he taught me to decide what I wanted to do and then try to go down that road, and I think that was important for me to do that. And
how does a young person decide what they want to do when they have such little experience and they have all these seemingly endless options?
It's not easy, and I think I was very fortunate because given the household that I grew up in and what was going on in Washington at the time, it was just a very natural thing for me to want to do. I think when I interview young people who come to see me and talk about career goals, I say, well, you tell me where you'd like to be in 10 years and maybe I can tell you how to get there. But if you don't know what you want to do, then I think it's more difficult. I think working for companies that you think may be in the field that you're interested in and at least getting a taste of it, I think in fairly short order, you can say, hey, this is something I really like to do, or it isn't, and move on to something else.
Well, that makes sense, getting some of that initial exposure. So you were in Washington, D.C., you earned your degree in civil engineering from Princeton.
Right.
And then what was the path that led you to the West Coast?
Well, I started in graduate school at MIT. I was studying structural engineering there, and the Korean War was going on. And I knew that when I got my master's degree at MIT, I would be eligible for the draft. And I decided that since I was a civil engineer and the Navy had an entire department for civil engineering, I would enlist in the Navy and join the Civil Engineer Corps. So after one semester as a structural engineer, I decided I'm not going to spend my life designing bridges. So I joined the Navy. They sent me to Officers Candidate School at Newport, Rhode Island. After 2 months, I got my ensign stripe, and they sent me to Port Hueneme for another 2 months, and then I was stationed at Point Mugu. So that was my first experience in California. I had never been west of Detroit before that.
Wow.
And I thought California was a great place, certainly a very dynamic place, and if I was going to be involved in real estate and real estate development, California was a good place to do it.
And so what was the year, about what year did you decide to make California your home?
Well, I was stationed in California, Point Mugu, in 1952. Then I met my future wife, who lived in Los Angeles in 1953. We were married in 1954, and that was pretty much the time we said, when I get out of the service, we'll come back to California. And we settled in Los Angeles for a few years before I came to Santa Barbara.
Wow, so you experienced Los Angeles the way that we see it in films, and it's the early Hollywood,
right.
And just an amazing.
Right. No smog, no freeways.
Yeah.
It's a lot different.
And no high rises.
Right.
Everything was very artistic back
Right.
then. Yeah.
Right.
And actually, films were being made.
That's right. Yeah, she lived in Westwood, and everything in Westwood was 2 stories. There weren't any high-rise buildings there.
So did you start right away investing in buying property, or how did you get your start in this area?
Well, not really. I decided when I got out of the service and I came back to California that I would go to work for a general contractor and get some experience in the actual constructing things. I supervised construction in the Navy, but that was a little different than actually working for a general contractor. So I worked for a very large general contractor, the George A. Fuller Company, which isn't around anymore, but they've probably been developing real estate for 100 years. And I worked for them for about a year. And in the meantime, my parents back in Washington, D.C. were friends of the Luria family. And Eli's father did pretty much what my father did, which was build a few apartment houses in Washington. And then the Lurias had 3 sons. Eli was one of the sons. And he was a successful developer with one of his brothers in Northern Virginia. Eli had graduated from UCLA and had always wanted to come back to California. So he had moved back to California even before I settled here after my service. And so my parents said, well, if you're going to be in California and you want to be in the development business, you should meet Eli because he's been successful at it in Washington, D.C. So we were introduced. I met Eli, and I think we were a good match. He was an art major at UCLA and very intuitive about development, and I was the engineer with a slide rule who could do the numbers. So we formed a partnership in 1956.
Wow. Okay. So that was really serendipitous that your folks had those connections.
Right.
Again, your parents coming in as early mentors.
Exactly.
I would say the same for me. They were definitely my first mentors as well. And so, did you look at him as a mentor or really as a partner? Did you look at him as a peer? Was it in some areas he knew more than you did, and you complemented one another? He
was definitely my mentor. I would say if I had one person in my life who I really learned a lot from, it was Eli. And he was 10 years older than I was. He was an experienced developer, but we were 50-50 partners, and I think I carried my load because the things I did and the things I was good at was different than what he was good at, but I learned an awful lot from him.
Right. And so you began the business together and started to acquire properties, develop properties?
When Eli and I formed our partnership, we had a contract to build one house. And I worked on that house while Eli looked for other opportunities. And we built a few small apartments in Los Angeles. And then things started going in a big way in Santa Barbara. We had friends back in Washington who told us that the old Camp Cook was being reactivated as Vandenberg Air Force Base, and there was a big housing boom going on in Santa Barbara at the time. So first Eli came up and looked around and ended up buying a few properties, and then we started building in Santa Barbara and Lompoc and Santa Maria, while I pretty much finished what we had in Los Angeles, and then I moved here.
Okay. So you were buying land at first?
We were buying land to develop.
Okay.
To develop.
And what were some of the first purchases that were made back in, I guess, the late 50s and early 60s?
Yeah, it was in the late 50s. We bought a property on Cliff Drive, 1040 Cliff Drive. I still remember the address, and we built 34 units there, apartment units.
Wow.
They're still there. We bought some property in Isla Vista. We built some duplexes in Isla Vista. The university had just moved to Isla Vista. They had been on the campus here in Santa Barbara, and actually had planned to move where City College was. That was their goal originally, and then I think they were able to acquire as a gift the land where the old Marine Air Force Base was during World War II, and so they moved to Isla Vista.
I see.
And Goleta, and so we did some building there. We bought some land for apartments in both Lompoc and Santa Maria, and bought land for subdivisions in those areas too.
Now, at the time, especially when you first started and you were 50-50 with Eli, where did the money come in to put in deposits.
Sure,
Did
sure.
it come from you, or did you find a way to get the bank to sponsor the whole thing?
Well, I had very little money, and Eli had some, but we worked with investors. We met people in Santa Barbara who were interested in investing with us, and so we did things with outside partners, money partners.
Hmm. Okay. And during those first formative years, were there any incidents or any situations that were regretful, that were just failures, that you look back and you're like, wow, those were mistakes.
Sure,
We
sure.
should have done it differently.
Sure, and in fact, I think you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes. And the first large project we had, we had bought 25 finished lots in Chino, and we were going to build houses there, sell them for $10,950. They were going to be VA, FHA sales, and interest rates increased just a little bit. I think they went from 5% to maybe 5.5%, and the market kind of collapsed. And so we were not able to get financing to build the houses, and we had a loan from the seller on the property, and he started foreclosure on us. And I think we came within a day of losing the property before someone bought it from us. And
Wow.
it was a great experience for me, because I think starting out and having a bad experience just proved to me that things don't always go the way you think they're going to go. And if you start out being successful and you have success after success, pretty soon you think, that's what it's all about. You just go from one success to another. And I think particularly in the development business, you can't be a developer if you're not very optimistic about things. And one of the mistakes I think a lot of developers make is they say, well, okay, how are we going to split the profits? They don't say, well, what happens if things don't go well? What's going to happen then? Can we survive or are we going to go bankrupt or go out of business if things don't go well? And having that first experience of a bad deal that didn't go well really taught me that you need to look at both sides of it.
Right.
And understand what the downside risks are. There aren't a lot of developers who stayed in business for 50 or 60 years and never gone through a really tough time. And I'm one of the few. I think it's because I've been cautious, and I've been optimistic, but at the same time I've said, well, what will happen if things don't go well? How am I going to handle that situation?
Right. That's very good advice. Yeah, a lot of, especially young people, don't even think about the potential pitfalls, right? So, in terms of the development of the career in the 50s and in the 60s, were you just steadily growing and starting to steadily see profits, or were there a couple of major victories that allowed you to, really elevate to another level in terms of potential investments and growth?
Well, I was very fortunate, I think, in one respect, because I sort of had a game plan for my career, and the game plan was to build houses and sell them to put food on the table, but at the same time start building investment properties that I could keep for the long haul and develop a management company. And I understood that the housing business is a very cyclical business. There are good years and there are bad years. There are years where it's great to be doing a lot of building, and there are years when you don't want to build any houses. But if you have a portfolio of investment properties and you're managing those properties, you can just sit on the sidelines for a year or two. As I said, I worked with Eli, and we learned that about the housing market because we were building in Lompoc and Santa Maria, and we found that one year the market would be very good, and the next year we couldn't give houses away. So it was always my goal to try to develop some investment properties, and started doing that. And by probably the mid-1960s, I was well on my way to doing that, and I've continued that. I still do some housing, but most of my business is investment properties now, apartments or office buildings or shopping centers, and then we manage them after that.
Mm-hmm. And so, just taking us back, you mentioned earlier that there were units that you sold for $10,900.
Yes.
And at the time, did that seem expensive, or was that really inexpensive? I mean, now, obviously, it's the cost of
Well, the housing I've built, I've always tried to be at the moderate to low end. My dad, another thing my father said to me, he said, build houses for poor people. There are more poor people than rich people. Mm-hmm. And I always tried to stay sort of the more affordable range of housing. The first housing I built in Santa Barbara, I think we sold for $21,000.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah,
I mean,
that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Are there still great deals out there today?
I think it's much more difficult today. I think you need to be well capitalized. I think lenders are not as easy to deal with as they used to be. They want personal guarantees on loans, and they want a lot of equity. So I would say it's much more difficult today than it was. We were a much more unsophisticated era back in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. And so it was really, so you're saying it was really more of a steady, disciplined approach to investing. Exactly. And a balancing act between the power years where things were really, great to invest and years you wanted to stay on the sideline. Yeah. There weren't really like these gigantic victories that, this is taking me over the hump, another hump here.
I don't think so, though. In the early '60s, I was introduced to a investor. Eli had pretty much retired by the early '60s. He'd made money back in Washington, and he was older than I was, and he didn't want to work as hard as I did. Mm-hmm. So we still remained very good friends for all of his life. But I met an investor who had a great deal of confidence in me, and it was much easier dealing with a single investor than it was trying to raise money for every deal.
Oh, wow, yeah.
In fact, the first meeting I had with him, he wrote me a check for about $500,000 on a project I was looking at. He really knew very little about me, but he'd heard about me, and he knew that I had a good reputation, I was honest, and I worked with him for about 10 years, and that was really a great boon to me to have someone like that behind me.
And those are the kinds of stories that we see sometimes in present day shows, shifting towards technology. There's a show really popular on HBO right now called Silicon Valley, which is a great, there's, a lot of it is really true. In fact, some of the way they describe a tech startup. But there's one of the early episodes shows a startup guy coming up with a great technology, and the CEO of a very big billionaire CEO of a big company comes in and offers him $10 million right there, for this kid who's basically a roommate in a house, and he turns it down. But I've heard stories like that. I think one of our other mentorship works interviews, Brian Coriat was telling us a story about how the first time he met someone, they wrote him a check for $50,000 as a, let's just try this out.
Yeah.
How does that happen? I mean, I think that knowing, was there something that you did in that meeting? Was it pure luck? Was it just your level of confidence? I mean, how does someone garner that kind of trust and that kind of opportunity, right out of the bat?
That's a difficult question to answer. It might be better to ask the investor. What does he see that makes him confident that those things will work? I worked with this investor for a number of years, and he had done some development on his own on the East Coast, so he knew something about the business. But I remember one time talking to him. We would drive to Santa Maria or Lompoc or San Ynez where we were building projects, and we'd talk on the way up and the way down. And he always was telling me, well, maybe you should do this or maybe you should do that. So one day I said to him, Leo, I only pay attention to about 1 out of every 10 of your ideas. And he said, if you paid attention to any more, I wouldn't invest with you.
Oh, wow. So he was older?
He was older.
Okay. Yeah, did he look at you as like the young maverick, like someone he could buddy around with?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
So. Yeah.
But at that point in your career, you already had, you had some pretty significant accumulated success stories. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like you were 1 year into the business. No. Right. Okay. So, I mean, lessened is that, you these things don't just happen.
No.
I mean, they're constructed.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
And so now take us into your full immersion into Santa Barbara, because for people that don't know these first 20 years, they look at you and they think, how is this possible? This is a person who is, incredibly generous to the community, philanthropic with the arts, with various nonprofits. No one really knows how much property you own in the region. although some people speculate. Was it really that, again, in the 70s and 80s, what were some of the points where you scratched your head and maybe said, wow, there's this shift happening in the community, there's this things happening. And, you know, I can think of things I've been told since I've only been here 8 years, but people said, oh, you know, there used to be stop signs on the 101.
That's right.
But you knew it, you know, way before, when maybe the 101 wasn't even paved. So I'm just curious, like what your thoughts were in the 70s and 80s. You were fully immersed in Santa Barbara.
Oh,
right?
yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, I actually moved to Santa Barbara in 1960, so I've been here for 54 years, but I was building here for 3 or 4 years before that. Mm-hmm. In fact, speaking of paved streets, when Eli and I first came here, we went to Isla Vista because the university had just moved there. The streets weren't paved in Isla Vista.
Wow.
They were gravel roads.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's see, do you have any photos from those days?
I probably have them somewhere.
Oh, that'd be a great treasure to share. Yeah, that'd be really wonderful to just kind of see that perspective.
Well, I've had, you know, as I said, Jacques, I had sort of a game plan. I was going to build houses to put food on the table and sell them, and I was going to build investment properties, and I was going to build up a property management company, and I haven't been distracted, let's put it that way. I pretty much stayed at that. And the other rule I had, and that's maybe laziness as much as anything, is the territory in which I've been building has been primarily within an hour's drive from here. So it's basically been Westlake to Santa Maria. In the early 70s, there were water moratoriums in Santa Barbara. That was before we got state water, and you really couldn't build in here. And I bought a couple of properties in Santa Rosa. I developed something in Santa Rosa, but I just found that I was much more comfortable being closer to home. Mm-hmm. A lot of developers build in a lot of different areas, but one of the things I like about this area is the barriers to entry are pretty high. You know, no big builder comes to Santa Barbara because they don't want to spend 5 or 10 years getting a project approved. They want to get it approved and build, and so that's made this pretty much my market. Mm-hmm. And I've pretty much stayed with that.
So in recent years, a lot of people are excited about the Funk Zone as becoming the new area in Santa Barbara to be developed. Well, what are your thoughts on that area, on that neighborhood, and have you invested at all? And if not, why did you pass?
I have not invested in that area, and I probably should have invested in that area. I'm very excited for the community because I think it's going to be a great benefit to Santa Barbara. I think things are happening in the community now, like the new project right across the street here on Victoria. That's just terrific for the city.
Yes.
And I think it's just really improving areas that have been sort of bypassed for a while. I have a daughter who lives in Brooklyn. The same thing is happening in Brooklyn. It's becoming very, very gentrified, and there are areas in Lower Manhattan. The meatpacking district is not a meatpacking district anymore. It's an arts district. Now, so these things are happening in a lot of places, and I think it's great. It just hasn't been my thing. Almost all of my projects have been buy a piece of land, develop it, and we sort of have a minimum size that we deal with. And a lot of those projects in the Funk Zone have been more boutique kinds of projects, with just a couple of exceptions. But I'm very impressed with people like Brian Kelly and others who have seen the opportunities and taken advantage of it. Right,
and there's some people that are speculating that that Haley is the next Abbot Kinney, which is one of the most popular neighborhoods in Venice. Any thoughts on Haley and how that could develop?
I think that'll happen on Haley Street too. I think there's a movement back into the city. People are tired of long commutes and living, far away from the kinds of services that these areas can provide. That's one reason why apartments have become so popular. People want to live close in. Mm-hmm. And I know in my business, we're really focusing on apartments right now because I think people, the old days where you worked for a company for 30 years and got a gold watch and retired, isn't happening anymore. I think particularly young people are much more mobile. And if you're in an apartment and you get a great job offer in Silicon Valley, 30 days notice, you can be there. If you own a house, you may have to say, well, I can't move until I can sell my house. Mm-hmm. So for me personally, the apartment market is the best part of the market right now, and that's really what we're focusing on.
Now, for young people, and you've mentored many folks, all age ranges. I'm friendly with Craig Zimmerman. He looks up to you very much, and I'm sure other executives in your companies do as well. What are some of the, some of the nuances and some of the things that you look for when you meet with somebody and consider engaging them, especially at a leadership level?
Well, I think their past experience is very important. How they deal with people is very important. I don't think anyone in this company has a big ego and does things just to build themselves up. I think dealing with people, managing people is really, really important. And you have to have the technical skills, but you have to be able to deal well with people, either people that you're supervising or just anyone in the company.
Paul Orfila, who I had the chance to interview for the MIT Enterprise Forum years ago, told me the similar answer to that question. And he said that one of the ways that he figured out people's dispositions and personalities was to go grab lunch with them. And he observed how they treated the wait staff. Any things that you look for? Is it just instinct, or are there any techniques that you've tried over the years that work well?
Well, I think Paul's idea is a great one. I haven't tried that one, but I'd like to be better at it than I am. I think that there are people like Craig who are really terrific at that. I'm a bricks and mortar man myself. I like to build things, and I've had many years of doing it. I'm still doing it. I still enjoy doing it. But I think being able to deal with people fairly and honestly is absolutely critical.
And anything that you want to add as far as your vision, as far as what you're seeing, some of your investments, some of your, you're not just investments in real estate, but you're investing tremendously in the community. Where do you see Santa Barbara in 20 years and 30 years?
Well, I think that one of the things that concerns me is that there have been a group of very philanthropic people in Santa Barbara, and most of us who are in that category are not too young anymore, and we hope that some of the younger people coming up will take our place. I realize, when you're raising a family and putting kids through college and making your career, it's not so easy to do that. But I think it's important down the line to look at what the community has done for an individual and then give back. I mean, that's been my approach. I mean, the Santa Barbara's just been absolutely fantastic for me, not only as a place to live, but a place to do business. And I really feel that, I can do a lot. It doesn't affect my lifestyle at all. And I think a lot of people really can do that if they really think about doing it. And when they get to the stage in life where they can do it, I need to give back to the community.
Yeah. Well, you set the bar high, and it's very inspiring. I certainly want to be more active, just seeing all the good work you do in the community and town. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, and really appreciate your time today.
Okay, great. Enjoyed it.
Thanks again.
Okay, John.